Great world building, interesting concepts, strong atmosphere, and somehow storytelling that keeps tripping over itself. If that sounds familiar, congratulations, you've officially been playing a lot of gacha games, because this genre is full of stories that feel like they're almost there, they have the pieces, they have the potential, and then something fundamental just doesn't click, which is why the latest Wuthering Waves update caught me completely off guard. I've seen that a lot of you guys have the same opinion, not just because it was good, but because it felt like the game finally showed what its storytelling could be if it keeps going in this direction. So in this video I want to talk about what worked so well here, what kind of future this opens up for Wuthering Waves as a story, and why this update feels like a potential turning point, not just another strong patch. A few people also pointed me towards a recent interview with the game's lead story writer, and I want to touch on that as well, because it gives us some insight into how the team thinks about storytelling, even if personally I found parts of that interview a bit surface level. Because right now, Wuthering Waves feels like it's standing at the crossroads, and whatever this update becomes the new standard, or just a standout moment, matters a lot. So before getting into what this means for the future, I think it's worth grounding this in how people are reacting to the update itself. There's really no question that Wuthering Waves 3.1 landed well, most people agree on that. And even if you look at it from a more objective narrative standpoint, it's simply a good story. Of course, this is a gacha, so no matter how strong the story is, there's always going to be a tribal response pushing back against it. That's just how these spaces work. But taken on its own merits, this update is clearly a step above what Wuthering Waves has done before, and honestly a step above a lot of gacha storytelling in general. I talked about this briefly in the previous video, but it's worth repeating here. The writing, the structure, and even the cinematography in this update feels more confident, more deliberate, like the story finally knows what it wants to be doing from scene to scene. Where I think things get a little more interesting though, is why people think this update worked. A lot of the praise I've seen focuses on the reveals, the protagonist's past, the background information we finally get, and the way the relationship between the protagonist and Ahmed unfolds. And I get that. Those reveals matter, they give context, they add intrigue, and for a lot of players, especially in a genre often framed around lighter character dynamics, the parent-child angle probably felt fresher and more emotionally grounded than usual. But I don't think that's the real reason this update was so effective. Those elements helped engagement, sure, but they're not what made the storytelling click. What made the difference here is something much simpler and honestly much more basic. For the first time, Wuthering Waves actually decided to use its protagonist properly. That might sound almost silly to say out loud, but it matters more than people realize. Rover is, by design, a self-insert protagonist, and I've talked about this before. Self-insert protagonists severely limit what a story can do, not just emotionally but structurally. When a character is written to be anyone, they usually end up being no one, reactive instead of active, present but rarely driving anything forward. Wuthering Waves isn't unique in this, a lot of gacha games make the same choice, but in this update, for whatever reason, that approach was quietly set aside. Instead of treating Rover as a placeholder, the story finally wrote them like a character, a real one, someone with perspective, emotional weight and narrative gravity. And the moment that happened, everything else started working. Because once the protagonist actually becomes the center of the story, not just mechanically but narratively, the entire structure has something to anchor itself to. Scenes don't just happen anymore, they connect. Emotional beats don't exist in isolation, they build on each other. Conflicts don't just appear because the plot needs friction, they resolve in a way that feels earned, because the protagonist is actively carrying the story through them. I want to pause here for a moment because this also ties into a question I've been asked about earlier updates, specifically about whatever characters like Prolova already had the same emotional depth as what we've seen here with Ahmed. And honestly, I don't think the difference is the depth of the tragedy itself. Prolova's story had emotional weight, it could affect you as a player. The problem was that it didn't have a proper anchor inside the story. At that point, the protagonist was still written too heavily as a self-insert. They weren't allowed to react, to process, or to carry the emotional consequences of what was happening. And because of that, neither could the world around them. So the emotion existed, but it couldn't fully propagate through the narrative. It hit you as a viewer, but it didn't reshape the story or the characters in a meaningful way. In 3.1, that changes, because the protagonist is finally written as a character. The emotional weight doesn't just exist, it moves. You see it reflected in their behavior. in their decisions and how other characters respond. That's the difference, not stronger tragedy, but a lens that finally allows the tragedy to matter. To put it in simpler terms, both Prolova and Amet are one side of their story, while the protagonist is the other side. In Prolova's case, the other side, even if it exists, was hollow. In Amet's case, clearly the other side of the story was well defined. That's why her story feels so much more impactful. That's why this update feels more grounded. That's why the pacing works. That's why even relatively simple scenes suddenly do more narrative work than they did before. Character interactions feel functional instead of decorative. One scene can establish motivation, deepen relationship, and move the plot forward all at once, which is exactly what good storytelling is supposed to do. The cinematography helps, sure, the presentation is stronger, but that's additive. The real shift happens because the story finally made use of its most basic tool, its main character. And that's why this update feels like such a leap forward, not because it introduced radically new ideas, but because it stopped sabotaging itself with some of the genre's most limiting narrative habits. The question is whether this was a conscious shift or just a moment where everything happened to line up. So the obvious question after all of this is this going to continue? And honestly, I don't know. That's the uncomfortable part. This didn't feel like a gradual evolution in Wuthering Waves storytelling. It felt like a shift, a jump, and because of that, there isn't really anything solid to ground my expectations on. I can point to a steady upward trend and say, this is clearly where the story is headed now. If anything, I probably have more doubts than confidence. Not because this update wasn't good, it absolutely was, but because one strong chapter doesn't guarantee a new direction. There's nothing yet that lets me say with any certainty that this is the new baseline rather than a standout moment where everything happened to line up. And that's frustrating, because if they do continue like this, Wuthering Waves has the potential to become one of the strongest narratives in the gacha space. Not by reinventing storytelling, not by doing anything radical, but simply by committing to the fundamentals they finally embraced here, treating the protagonist as a real character, letting scenes breathe, grounding conflicts emotionally, and allowing the story to flow naturally instead of forcing it forward through structure alone. Of course, even if they stick to this level of writing, not every update is going to hit the same way. That's normal. This chapter landed especially hard because of Amet and her relationship with the protagonist. You can't recreate that exact emotional impact every time, and you shouldn't try to. Stories need variation, high moments and quieter ones, action-heavy sequences and slower, more grounded scenes. That rhythm isn't a flaw, it's how long-form storytelling survives. What matters isn't that every update feels like 3.1. What matters is whatever the floor of the writing has been raised. And that's where my hope sits. I genuinely want them to continue in this direction. Despite my doubts, I really do, because this update showed what Wuthering Waves is capable of when it stops holding itself back. At the same time, I've seen some people suggest that the next step should be leaning harder into tragedy, killing of characters, pushing darker outcomes, escalating emotionally through loss. Personally, I hope they don't go down that route. That kind of tragedy has never really worked for me. I don't think it's necessary to create a strong or meaningful story, and I often find it cheap when it's used as a shortcut to emotional weight. There are so many other ways to create tension, engagement, and depth without relying on shock or loss as the primary tool. But that's a matter of taste. We'll have to wait and see whatever they take it. What complicates all of this, and what makes me hesitant to fully trust this shift, is what the writers themselves say about their approach. Which brings me to the interview. After this update came out, a few people pointed me towards a recent interview with Wuthering Waves' lead story writer, and on paper this feels like the perfect follow-up, a chance to understand what the team was aiming for, and whatever this shift in quality reflects a deeper change in how they think about storytelling. But honestly, I wasn't particularly impressed by it. Not because anything in the interview was wrong, but because almost everything it talked about stayed on the surface. A lot of the answers focus on ideas like emotion first, emotional resonance, and guiding the player's feeling through audio-visual language. And yeah, of course, you're writing a character-driven fantasy story. Emotion should come first. That's not a revelation, that's the baseline. That's what storytelling is supposed to do in the first place. The same goes for the idea of a wave-like rhythm to the narrative. High moments, quieter moments, emotional peaks, followed by calmer stretches. Again, none of this is controversial, and none of this is particularly new. Even individual scenes work this way. You vary pacing so the story doesn't exhaust itself. That's just fundamental narrative structure, whatever you're writing a novel, a film, or a live service game. And that's where the interview starts to lose me. There's also a moment in the interview where the protagonist's portrayal in this update is framed as a kind of character evolution. And this is one point where I fundamentally disagree. What happens in 3.1 isn't evolution, it's a shift. Evolution is gradual, it's built over time through accumulated experience and visible change. Until this update, the protagonists largely stay the same, restrained, neutral, and structurally limited by the self-insert role. Then, in 3.1, that limitation is suddenly lifted. That doesn't make the change bad. In fact, it's one of the reasons this update works so well. But calling it evolution glosses over the real issue, which is that this kind of writing could have been there much earlier. And that distinction matters because it raises the same question this entire video keeps circling back to. Was this a conscious change in direction, or simply a moment where the constraints were temporarily removed? Because while it talks about how they approach storytelling in a very general sense, it doesn't really say anything about their vision for the story. It doesn't address the specific structural choices that have held Wuthering Waves back in the past. It doesn't talk about risks. It doesn't talk about long-term stakes, and it definitely doesn't talk about the parts of the narrative that have been most contentious or limiting. For example, there's nothing about the protagonist being written as a self-insert for so long, or whatever that's something they consciously moved away from. There's nothing about antagonist design, long-term conflict, or how they plan to avoid repeating the same narrative beats over and over again. There's no discussion of what they think didn't work before, only what they believe in at a very high level. And that makes the interview feel safe. It reads like a set of principles rather than a commitment. A description of how storytelling should work in theory, not how this story is going to move forward in practice. That's why it doesn't really reassure me about the future of Wuthering Waves narrative. Not because the writers don't understand storytelling, they clearly do, but because understanding fundamentals doesn't automatically translate into consistent execution, especially in a live service game. The update itself showed restraint, confidence, and focus. The interview, on the other hand, doesn't explain why that restraint showed up here, or how they plan to protect it going forward. And without that, it's hard for me to tell whatever this chapter represents a deliberate change in direction, or just a moment where all the right choices happen to align. At the end of the day, I'm just not a big fan of these kinds of interviews. They tend to feel perfunctory to me. On the surface, it can sound like something important is being said, especially to an untrained ear. But when you slow down and really listen, it's mostly just the fundamentals being restated in nicer words. There's even a moment in the interview where the lead writer talks about prioritizing emotion over rigid logic, about letting players feel something first and understand the details later. And again, that's not wrong, but it's also not insightful. That's storytelling 101. If anything, it only highlights how low the bar usually is in this genre that saying something so basic can feel meaningful. What I was really hoping for was more discussions about structure, about long-term stakes, about the risks of live service storytelling, about what they've learned from what didn't work before, something that acknowledges the specific challenges gacha narratives struggle with, instead of speaking in broad, universally agreeable terms. Because when everything stays at that level, the interview doesn't actually tell me whatever this update reflects a conscious shift in direction, or just a strong execution of ideas they always believed in. And that difference matters. So, where does this leave Wuthering Waves? For me, this update matters not because it answers questions, but because it changes the conversation. It proves that this game is capable of telling a story that's emotionally grounded, restrained, and confident in a way it hadn't really shown before. Not through spectacle alone, not through escalation, but through fundamentals, character, flow, and focus. And that's why I keep coming back to the same tension throughout this video. On one hand, 3.1 shows real potential. It shows what happens when the story stops getting in its own way. When the protagonist is allowed to be a character instead of a placeholder. When scenes are written to connect rather than just exist. When emotion comes from context and build-up instead of from shock. On the other hand, potential isn't the same thing as direction. One strong chapter doesn't automatically mean a new standard. Live service games are especially prone to moments like this, flashes of clarity followed by a slow return to safer, more familiar patterns. And the interview, for all its good intentions, doesn't really tell me whatever the team is prepared to protect what worked here over the long term. That's the part I'm still unsure about. The question is whatever the structure of the game, the pacing, the update cadence, the genre expectations will allow these fundamentals to remain at the center of the narrative instead of being slowly pushed aside again. I genuinely hope this update isn't an exception. I hope it repeats a raised baseline, even if further chapters don't hit the same emotional highs. I hope Wuthering Waves chooses to build on what worked here instead of treating it as a one-off success, because if they do, this game could quietly become one of the most interesting long-form narratives in the gacha space. But hope is uncertainty. For now, all we really have is a moment, a chapter that showed what's possible. Whatever that moment turns into a direction, it's something only time and future updates can answer, and I will be watching closely. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. If you enjoy these kinds of discussions about storytelling, narrative structure, and where long-running game stories succeed or starts to struggle, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel a lot, and it lets me keep making this kind of content. I'm genuinely curious how this update felt for you. Whatever you loved it, had mixed feelings, or you're still unsure where Wuthering Waves is heading. I love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep going, there's another video on the screen right now that you might find interesting. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.